I wanted to apologize if there is any background noise. I am attending the RIMS conference in San Antonio, Texas today, and I have stepped out of the exhibit hall and I've tried to find a quiet room, but it isn't as quiet as I'd hoped, so my apologies if there's any background noise. I am the president of ICOR, and one of my roles with ICOR is to run the education program, and as part of that, my role is to serve on several different standards committees in order to be on the front end of what's going on with our professional development and how standards are developed. Our webinar objectives today include understanding how to manage how managing change contributes to building a more resilient organization, as well as the opportunity to gain knowledge of different techniques that you can use to forecast change, and to learn how understanding and managing emerging issues can increase your organization's crisis readiness. During the webinar today, if you have questions, you can use the questions button. I will probably, just because of the environment here, save questions to the end, and if we run out of time, I will answer the questions individually so that you get an answer to your questions. We're going to start today's webinar with a poll, and just to get an idea of who's here today, which of the following best describes your role at your organization, and you can choose all that apply. And if you do choose other, if you could go ahead and tell what that other is in the questions pane, that helps us to get a better idea of who's here.
Linda,
give you another
this is Margot.
Yeah.
It looks like a majority of the people are business continuity and crisis management, about 85%.
Okay, it's good to know our audience today. Are you going to go ahead, if you go ahead and close the poll? And it looks like we have 17% are actually, are you going to go ahead and share the poll as well so they can see the results? It looks like we have about 17% with others. So yeah, please share in the questions pane what kind of job you represent. So given the fact that most of you are in the business continuity and crisis management space, I'm going to focus on that for some of the conversation today. We're going to go ahead and start talking about crisis readiness. And if you're on the business continuity side, I want you to start thinking about the language that you use to talk to people in your organization about, you know, we often use the word disasters. And I'm going to suggest that using the word crisis, being crisis ready is another phrase that you can use versus being prepared. And sometimes this language actually helps us to communicate better. So there's a great paper written by a gentleman called Paul Seelight. In fact, he's written quite a few things, and he will be referenced at the end of the presentation so that you can go ahead and read more about what he has to say. But he's identified 4 categories of crisis readiness, and we're going to talk a little bit about each one. The first one talks about external relationships, then your internal structure of your organization, the leadership that you have, as well as what kind of systems do you use to manage the organization. He also says that when you're looking at your external relationships, that crisis-ready organizations monitor trends in their external environments. They also assess potential risks or issues, as well as manage stakeholder relationships. And I really was struggling this week when I was putting together the final version of this presentation was to talk about definitions first or last. And so the last ended up winning. This idea of talking about risks and talking about issues. And again, it kind of depends on what part of the organization you're working in, whether you're talking about issues or risks. And I don't want to worry about what they are right now. So I want you to think about anything that we're saying here. If I say the word issues, you can also think about the word risks and vice versa. And what they have found is that crisis-ready organizations appear to use their past real-world experience as a driver for improvement as well. So understanding that when you've been through an incident or you've had a crisis or a disaster, you're much more prepared for it in the future, even if what happens isn't exactly the same thing that has happened to you in the past. But understanding your external relationships is a really important aspect. The internal structure also is comprised of different attributes. And one of the things that he says is that this diffusion of authority throughout the organization, making sure that you're flexible and that there's shared decision making. There's a lot of case studies out there where it's showing when you have single points of failure for decision making, as well as other aspects of being prepared, is a really important piece to consider. While you do need to have a designation of who's responsible for crisis readiness, whether it's one person or a team of people, or that responsibility is pretty much spread throughout your organization, it should be documented and everybody understand who is responsible. I heard a story yesterday here at RIMS where they found that they were having incidents and nobody was telling the right person about it. And so their incidents were lasting much longer than they should have, just because there wasn't a communication area, because throughout the organization they didn't have an idea of who was responsible and who they should contact. So as part of that, making sure that you have communication that flows internally and externally, we've often heard how communication or lack of communication actually makes managing any sort of issue or risk or incident much worse than it could be. There needs to be a shared sense of organizational purpose and mission. Why are we here? We're all moving in the same direction, as well as a culture that welcomes error reporting, continual improvement, as well as learning. And again, we see that word capacity for flexibility, not just in decision making, but in how you operate. When he's discussing leadership attributes, they're talking about leadership as all the way down to who do you recruit and motivate? Are you choosing the right people? Even if you're having, if you're trying to have a crisis management team, are people being hired with this idea of sort of the responsibilities they're going to have to manage risk, to manage incidents, to manage crises? Can they handle stress? Or are we just putting into place people and responsibilities based on their job title? You also need, of course, people that are going to implement sound day-to-day business management practices. And back to this culture of trust, understanding that you need to be asking employees for their input on key decisions, as well as considering both short and long-term recovery efforts. What are we doing now? What do we need to be planning for in the future? And lastly, he talks about management systems. And here I went to a part of ISO 22316, Organizational Resilience Principles and Attributes, to talk about management systems. And we don't really say exactly what we mean by management systems, meaning there's not a list of things that you have to do. But what it is, it's really more of a way that you operate. And the standard says that the design, development, and coordination of management disciplines and their alignment with the organization's strategic objectives are fundamental to enhancing organizational resilience. And in the standard itself, it gives you a long list of management systems that you could consider, everything from asset management to financial management, human resource management, to formal management systems like we maybe are more familiar with, things like your business continuity management system or your quality management system or your environmental health and safety management system. There's all types of management systems, but the concept here is that you should be operating even your crisis readiness as a system within your organization and try to remove as many silos as possible. Next, I want to look at some of the behaviors that we have identified in the standard as well as in the different studies with organizational resilience. This ability to absorb and adapt. So organizational resilience is the ability of an organization to absorb and adapt in a changing environment, to enable it to deliver its objectives, and to survive and prosper. So we're looking at a balance between not just delivering objectives, but also to survive and prosper. So some of us, when you're on the risk management side or business continuity crisis management side, are really focusing on the survival side of the organization, where the rest of the organization is looking at how are we going to make sure that we continue to deliver our objectives and to prosper. Some other behaviors are the concepts of anticipating, planning, and responding. It says that more resilient organizations can anticipate and respond to threats as well as opportunities arising from sudden or gradual changes in their internal and external context. And again, I often think about this personally as negative things that might be happening, but I also want you to think about positive things that might be happening within your internal and external context, and being able to understand what those changes are and how you can take advantage of those. We're looking again at anticipating, planning, and responding. More resilient organizations can anticipate and respond to threats and opportunity arising from sudden or gradual changes. And organizational resilience is enhanced when an organization has the ability to anticipate, plan, and respond to change. Also need to be aware of situations that are likely to influence change. And then once you have done that, you need to monitor and evaluate the organization's context, including your interdependencies, your political, regulatory environments, as well as competitor activities under those changing circumstances. So I hope what you're seeing here is a common theme. We're talking about managing change. And each one of these behaviors contributes to effectively managing that change. So how do you get in front of change so that you're ready for it, not just reacting to it, but driving change? So here's where that balance comes in of understanding what change is coming and then making sure that you're prepared to manage in that change. But if you actually get out in front of it enough, you can become the change maker. So we're going to talk next about forecasting. Remembering, though, of course, change is hard and not changing is fatal. So before we get into the real detail of forecasting, I wanted just to give an example of an organization that has done a really good job managing change. Netflix started in 1997 selling and renting DVDs by mail. And I can tell you that I never did this. I did not see any reason to do this by mail. I had a Blockbuster video down the street, so we just went to there and got our videos from there. Every Friday night, that's where you'd find our family. And they really didn't even begin making a profit in 2003. But they not only started, but by the time they started making a profit, by 2006, they saw their sales beginning to fall. And so they had a decision to make. Are we going to double down on our core business? Or are we going to shift our focus to developing a video on-demand internet platform? And that's what they decided to do in 2007. Remember, technology has changed a lot between 1997 and 2007. And so because of that changing technology, it gave Netflix an opportunity to change their core business, an opportunity they couldn't have had back in 1997 and probably not even in 2003, because the Internet of Things wasn't able to support that core business. So being able to stay ahead of their potential troubles has enabled Netflix to continue growing. And as of 2017, it operates its internet streaming platform in almost every country of the world. And I have to tell you, I use Netflix all the time when I'm traveling, maybe a little much more so than when I'm at home. But Netflix is, my go-to for entertainment when I'm in a hotel or traveling somewhere else. And the key story here is that you need to adapt, you need to innovate, or you are going to suffer or potentially go out of business. So let's look next at some companies that failed to innovate and change. Ironically, Kodak was the first digital camera. They created the first digital camera in 1976. And they thought, oh, we better not do this, because they said, we're going to cannibalize our film sales. If we move to digital, what will happen to our film? And then by the middle 2000s, they realized that the film sales were really, really going down. And they decided, okay, we better digitize. But it was too late. So because they failed to innovate and change in a timely manner, even though what they had was a good product, they ended up going bankrupt in 2012 and having to change their business model. So they could have been the main company doing this, and it ended up that they weren't. I mentioned Blockbuster. The Blockbuster that used to be down the street from me now sells golf equipment. Blockbuster went bust, and they were not able to compete with the Netflix, as well as other cable things as well. It wasn't just Netflix, but it was an aspect of that. My first phone was a BlackBerry. They had the largest sales, and they owned the market in 2012, but they were unable to compete with smartphones. And so for the most part, they have gone away. My next phone was a Motorola Razr. we say the Motorola Razr was also the bestseller. And in 2011, they were really the top sales as far as the smartphone went. And they were not able to modify and adjust, or innovate and adjust. And so their sales really have become much lower than they used to be. And then we talk about Borders. You know, Borders Books is gone. They failed to go online. They made the decision to go online really too late so that they weren't able to take advantage of the market that ended up going to other booksellers. So let's get into start looking at some techniques for managing change. I'm going to introduce each of the techniques, and then we'll dive into them in a little more detail. The Delphi method is one. Doing a trend impact analysis is another. Doing a situational analysis is a third, and there's lots of different types of situational analysis. We're just using the picture for a SWOT because it looked pretty. Also doing a competitive analysis. And lastly, looking at horizon scanning. So let's look first at the Delphi method. And this is a method I've actually never heard of until I started looking at different techniques and methods for forecasting and for managing change. And in this case, it looks like it is a method that takes a bit of time. So what they do is they bring a bunch of experts in to do some forecasting of events. So they use, the key thing is that you have to have experts. And they fill out a questionnaire of what events they see as coming in the future. What sorts of issues do you think we're going to need to deal with? And they use this forecasting to assess some of the complex issues. And the model here is collective human intelligence, back to the experts piece. And so what they try to do is to build consensus among those experts on their predictions. So experts review a series of questionnaires anonymously. Then they get all the responses back, and then they read everybody else's responses, and they go through and they do another questionnaire based on the responses from the first questionnaire, and then experts are allowed to adjust their answers in subsequent rounds. And they go through this method until they have some results that they feel are what they are looking for. And the key thing is that those experts have reached a consensus in their forecasting on future trends. So it's sort of like taking, you go and people are throwing darts and trying to get consensus and getting all of those darts at a bullseye for where they're going to focus that organization's planning and preparations for future trends. They use a facilitated and structured approach. Brainstorming is part of that process. And an outcome of this is also a scenario development. So when they look at their future trends and what it is that they're going to start planning for, they develop a scenario around that trend analysis. Another outcome of this is that it really enriches multidisciplinary efforts in order to identify trends. So you have to make sure with this method that you've got experts from a variety of areas so that you don't have kind of mind speak where everybody's thinking about things and looking at things in the same manner. So here's that multidisciplinary approach is something that's going to work to your benefit. The next type of analysis we're going to look at is the trend impact analysis. And ironically, this is done using historical data. So when they're doing this sort of analysis, they're going to look backwards. So they put up a baseline scenario constructed from what has happened to us in the past. And this is, I've kind of got my risk hat on this week since I'm at RIMS, and that where you can use your risk people and your insurance people to look at what sort of things have happened to us in the past, where are our highest risks, what are the trends that we're seeing and the types of risks that are impacting our organization, our community, our lines of business, not just thinking about natural disasters, which is something that sometimes we get caught up in because they're big, but looking at other types of historical trends. So what the methodology here and the reason and the thinking here is that future events that may affect your scenario that you've been planning for are identified, and then they're evaluated on the basis of their probability of occurrence as well as their degree of impact. And these are terms that you may find very familiar to you depending on your role in your organization, looking at what things might happen, what's the probability of them happening, and then what's the degree of impact. But again, this trend impact analysis is looking at your historical trends and then trying to make a prediction on what that might mean for the future. And so the outcome of doing an analysis like this means creating some future scenarios. So just like the Delphi method, you're trying to, an outcome of the analysis is what kinds of things are we planning for? What kinds of things do we think are going to happen? And making your best judgment on this. Remember, this is kind of a combination of science and knowledge because we don't know what's going to happen. So these are predictions and trying to use the best way to make those predictions. The third type of analysis is called the situation analysis. I've also heard it called situational analysis. And there's several different ways that you can do this. And it's specifically an analysis of your internal and external environments. And you can see with the SWOT analysis here was where they look at the strengths and weaknesses of your organization as well as opportunities and threats that you might face. So the purpose of a situational analysis is to understand your organization's capabilities, what are your customer needs, and what's your business environment. It also hopes to provide indications of organizational and product position, as well as its ability to survive. And the outcome of this analysis is an understanding of your capabilities in the marketplace, as well as some of the things you might be vulnerable to. Another type of situational analysis besides the SWOT analysis is what's called the 5 C's. The 5 C's stand for company, competitors, customers, collaborators, and climate. So when you're looking at your company, what are your strengths and weaknesses of your own organization? What's your business model? What's your mission? What are your continual improvement? What are you trying to do? How are you trying to grow? The competitors part of this is who are your competitors? What are they doing? What is their market reach? And how can you remain strong against your competitors? Also, the third C is customers. What do our customers want from us? What are their needs and expectations? How can we meet their needs? Under the collaborators, they talk about your suppliers and your distributors. Who do you depend on? And who do you distribute to? And the last one, climate, is really looking at doing that analysis itself. So it might also include doing the pestle analysis, where you look at political aspects, environmental aspects, as well as other aspects in your analysis. So this is another one that you can do as well. Competitive intelligence or competitive analysis is something that sometimes we forget about. Your competitors are looking at what you're doing, and just like the competitor analysis under the 5 C's, this is something that we want you to not underestimate the value of, and understanding that in the business continuity and crisis management arena, you might not have a role with this, but understanding who you should be talking to in your organization that is doing that competitive analysis. Who are our competitors? What are the vendors that we're depending on? What industries might we want to reach to, or that we're already in? What's our market reach? And you can bet that your marketing people understand this, as well as people that are in your R&D and business development. So understanding competitive intelligence, is about defining, gathering, and distributing intelligence about the products, customers, competitors, and any aspect of the environment needed to support strategic decision-making and the early identification of risk and opportunities as well. So because of its actual definition of the identification of risk and opportunities, I want you to think about how your role in risk and crisis and business continuity can support the role of the competitive intelligence, and making sure that you're not doing your risk assessment or issues management process, ignoring parts of the organization or being siloed in what you're doing. Lastly, we're going to look at horizon scanning. I recently came back from Australia, where I was participating as an expert in the technical committee for ISO 22301 and 22313 in our updates. And before that event got going, there was a conference that was also being held in Australia that I was invited to speak at. And one of the other speakers was talking about horizon scanning in the context of business continuity. And his purpose, I guess, in doing this was to say that it's not something that they should be doing because you can't, measure, you don't know what's going to happen, so you might as well just wait to see what happens. And I was sort of disappointed by that presentation because there's a lot of benefit to horizon scanning, and organizations of all kinds are doing this on a regular basis. And it's really important that as business continuity and crisis professionals that you understand the value as well as the methodology of horizon scanning. So it is a systematic examination of information to identify potential threats, risks, and emerging issues and opportunities. And it's a term that's used for analyzing the future that allows for better preparedness and the incorporation of mitigation and exploitation into the policymaking process. The example that I'm going to give to you today is sort of a government example, but it can be obviously, the methodology is useful in any sort of organization, so we're going to be using the word policy. But understanding that all organizations, you all run by policy. If there's not a policy for something, you won't be doing it. So understanding that policy also drives decision making. So horizon scanning also considers how emerging trends and developments might affect, again, your policy and your practice. What are those things that you're going to do as a result of policy? And the outcome of horizon scanning is that it allows for a longer-term strategic approach and makes present policy more resilient to future uncertainty, because it is correct, nobody knows what's going to happen in the future, which is why you need to be paying attention to trends in order to see what it is might be coming your way. So in 2013, the UK government, specifically its civil service part of the government, decided to put together a formal horizon scanning program. And they took their different departments and they put them together in what's called communities of interest. And they decided they were going to deliver horizon scanning on a series of work strands, and they focused on the following areas. They wanted to know what were the emerging technologies, what were the emerging economies, what was going to happen with their changing supply as well as demand of resources, not only from the UK government itself, but from the economy. And again, if you're changing who you're selling to, that's going to go to the changes that are happening in the U.S. right now with, the supply chain as far as what we're exporting and importing and the fees that are going to be happening with that. But those things do impact all of the businesses operating within that country. So understanding that is really important. Also, I found it was really interesting that they wanted to really study the changing social attitudes of young people, because young people are our future. How they perceive the world is going to change how they want to be involved in business and other parts of the organization and country. And they also were looking at the future of demographic change in the UK. And this is a challenge that many countries are facing with political unrest in different countries, dealing with, trying to deal with refugees and create safe places for them and the cost dealing with that, as well as understanding that, the UK, like other countries, is no longer, I don't want to say British, but, they're more representative of the world, just like the United States is. So what they did when they were implementing this horizon scanning effort is that they had been kind of passive and episodic with this, meaning if they saw an incident, then they would do some horizon scanning, but it was really done passively. So they decided they were going to use a very focused and continuous approach. It was going to be something that they did constantly. And so they assigned a team of people responsibility for doing this, and they put together really a core team and a practice for how they were going to conduct horizon scanning. And they found that it was really useful in detecting and assessing emerging threats as well as opportunity. And this horizon scanning provided guidance to them in decision and policy making ahead of actual events. So they found that they were on the front end of a lot of things because they were able to forecast that they were coming. They had, this might be something that's going to impact us. And they started preparing ahead of time. And maybe not everything that they prepared for actually happened, but they were much more prepared for things that did happen. And so they kind of summarized this to say that they felt that it was more important than ever to have the best possible understanding of the world around us and how that world is changing so that policymakers can prioritize and adapt effectively. And when you're talking about organizational resilience, we're talking about managing change, adapting, being able to be in a position where you are best positioned to manage something that new that comes along, whether it is, a threat or an opportunity for your organization's business. So let's take our next poll. Which of the methods for forecasting change are used in your organization? And again, you can choose all that apply.
Results are coming in.
Really,
we'll give it a couple more seconds.
These results are really interesting. So I see that more than 75% of you are using the situational analysis, and I'm assuming that maybe that's part of what you're doing with your risk assessment. It isn't surprising to me that only 11% of you are using the Delphi method. This is the one I was least familiar with myself, and I also felt that it was probably the most arduous, just to get experts to spend the time to do it. The second most one was a trend impact analysis based on historical data, which also makes sense in the business continuity and crisis management space, that we're kind of planning for the future based on what's happened to us in the past. And I also I was really encouraged to see that, between 29 and 31% of you are doing horizon scanning as well as competitive analysis, or at least your organization is. So that's really encouraging. Thank you for that. So I want to talk now about issues. Every management system standard begins with the same requirement. And it starts with understanding the context of your organization. So you need to understand what your organization does as well as the context in which it operates. So it starts at the very beginning by saying the organization shall determine external and internal issues that are relevant to its purpose and that affect its ability to achieve the intended outcomes of your whatever management system, whether it's business continuity or information security, quality, environmental health and safety, whatever that management system is. Says you shall determine your external and internal issues. And so I'm hoping that based on the fact that when we were looking at doing that forecasting, that most of you are doing some kind of forecasting, that you're using that forecasting to determine some of your external and internal issues. Clause 6 also goes on to talk about that you need to determine your risks and opportunities. And I think most of us are really good at determining risks, and we're not so good at looking at opportunities. So it says that you need to take actions to address your risks and opportunities. So when planning for your management system, the organization shall consider the issues that we just talked about in clause 4.1 and the requirements referred to in 4.2. And 4.2 talks about legal and regulatory requirements, contractual requirements, those sorts of things, and requirements of your interested parties to determine the risks and opportunities that need to be addressed. And this, of course, gives assurance that your management system can achieve its intended outcomes, that you're preventing or reducing undesired effects, and that you're achieving continual improvement. So the standard in clause 4 and clause 6 talks about issues, talks about understanding your context, and determining your risks and opportunities. So the question becomes, do we need to be talking about issues management? And this is something that I hadn't really considered much until the last few years, when we were starting to talk about organizational resilience and talking about what are people in other disciplines, how are they addressing, things that happen to them or things that might happen to them. And we found that there's a whole discipline called issues management out there. And they define it as the process by which internal and external issues that have the potential to significantly impact organizational performance are identified, prioritized, analyzed, and resolved with the goal of preventing crises and seizing opportunities. And my guess is if you're on the crisis management side of your organization, this might be something that the language that you might use versus talking about risk management. Just a little bit different. And what they're saying here is that effectively responding to emerging issues may result in the successful aversion of a future crisis. So this idea of issues management and crisis management seem to be tightly aligned. And not just like we see that business continuity management and risk management are tightly aligned. And I'm not going to say that they're exactly the same, but I'm saying that there's enough parallels where if you have within your organization, parts of your organization talking about issues management and crisis management, and you're siloed from the conversations that you're having in business continuity management and risk management, you need to close those silos. I know that even within business continuity and risk management, there's silos, and there's silos between business continuity and crisis management and risk management and crisis management. So we have lots of silos to deal with. The larger the organization, the more silos we have. So I'm putting that out as a challenge to you, is to identify how other parts of your organization are talking about the same sorts of things that you're talking about, and learning how to talk to them in their own language. So if they're using the word issues and crisis, maybe that's what you need to do in order to make what you're doing relevant to more parts of the organization. Wanted to bring up an issue that obviously has been in the news the last few days. And by the way, when I was watching the news today, they were using the word issue. And I found that really interesting. They didn't call it they called it an incident, but they were really using the word issue versus risk. And so Starbucks has identified an issue as a result of having an incident. And actually the CEO of Starbucks said those exact words today. So I was busy adding this in and typing this down as I was watching the news this morning. And what the leadership team at Starbucks did was immediately address the issue. They offered their apologies, and they said they're going to take this issue as an opportunity to educate. Those are exact words. We are going to take this issue as an opportunity to educate. So whether you're using this as an incident or an issue, it doesn't really matter. You have to have some action. And so the action that they're going to take is they're going to close all 8,000 stores on May 29th with the purpose of preventing future incidents from occurring. And at first I was like, wait a minute, okay, I get that you're going to take this as an opportunity to educate, but think about the impact here. Closing all 8,000 stores on the same day means that nobody's going to be able to buy Starbucks coffee on May 29th. For some of you, that's a big deal. Now, I don't even drink coffee, so it won't matter to me. But I think they're making a big statement here. They're not saying that they're going to educate and they're going to educate their people, so that they don't have anybody out of the store at the same time. So that if they have 20 employees, they're going to do it five employees at a time, so it doesn't impact their sales. They're going to do it all at the same time. I think that's a huge statement. And this is something that they probably didn't even need to do, but they wanted to make sure the public understood their commitment to making sure that their stores were a safe place for anybody to hang out and to buy coffee. So again, I wanted to go back and look at the actual definitions and what, something an issue or a risk. And I read a ton of things in the past week or two, trying to understand the relationship between an issue and a risk. And I can tell you that literature is unclear as to whether an unresolved issue becomes a risk or if a risk becomes an issue. So I don't even want you to worry about it because it made my mind spin. And because there's no ISO definition for issue, that also further complicated things. So my next meeting in October when we're in Norway, I'm going to ask that question of the people that are responsible for doing terms and definitions. And, ISO 31000 and, RIMS as well defines risk as the effect of uncertainty on objectives, and issues can have an effect on your objectives as well. So I don't know that it matters exactly what term that we use here, just as long as you have a process and a procedure for managing this. So let's take a little bit closer look at the issue management process, and you're probably going to find this looking familiar to you. You have to identify your issue and document what it is. So for Starbucks, that issue was the fact that it looked like there was some racial profiling going on for people that were just sitting in their store. Then you need to analyze that issue. Is this a problem for us? Well, obviously Starbucks felt that this was a problem. It wasn't something that they could ignore. It was going to impact their business and their reputation. It was their reputation, because people are still going to drink coffee, but will they move to a different coffee shop to do that? And so this became an immediate priority for Starbucks. For your organization, you might identify an issue that you think might be a priority in the future, so you're going to keep an eye on it. That right now it's not something that you think is going to hurt you immediately, but you want to keep an eye on it. Or if you're looking at an opportunity, different coffee shops might be using this as an opportunity for them to say, come to our coffee shop. We're a great place to hang out, meet people, talk to people, run your business, and drink coffee and enjoy it while you're here. So there needs to be some action planning. I'm pretty certain that Starbucks is working on how they're going to implement this training that they're going to have on May 29th. And I respect them for not trying to do it immediately. They have to spend some time on what that training is going to look like. So understanding that whatever issue you identify, whether it's a new market that you want to explore, or a new opportunity, or something that you think might actually hurt your organization, there needs to be some time and some actions made to figure out how it is you're going to manage that issue. You need to also monitor your issue. So if you've identified an issue that you're not going to address immediately, you're going to want to monitor it to see if it's something you need to address sooner. If you go back to looking at the example I gave earlier today, which was the Borders going online, for example. They went online, but it was too late. So you see other products, things that if you don't manage that change quickly, you want to control the issue. So I can pretty much feel that Starbucks has controlled that this isn't going to happen again. And then you need to have some kind of resolution. So if this is an issue that kind of has a beginning and an end, you want to make sure that you're monitoring so it doesn't happen again, and you're controlling it so it doesn't happen in the future. And then, at some point, is it resolved? Have you made this part of what you're doing so that it's not going to happen again? Or is this an opportunity that you've decided to, this now becomes a new line of business or something that you do on a regular basis? Or have you decided now we're not going to go that way, so we're going to close it out? And you might see that this process is similar to a risk assessment. We could say you're going to do risk identification, you're going to document what your risks are, you're going to analyze how they impact you, you're going to prioritize which ones you're going to treat, you're going to make actions and planning on how you're going to manage that risk, and then you're going to monitor and control it as you go. So, this process is very similar to a risk assessment, and this is where I get back to, is something an issue? Is it a risk? I don't really care at this point, but is your organization forecasting in some manner to look and see what types of things you might want to take advantage of or that you might be vulnerable to? So the challenge I have for you today is to integrate that forecasting with managing risk. Oftentimes there's little connection between the data that you're connecting or the data that you're collecting and emerging issues and managing risk. We're so busy collecting data that we might not actually be understanding what we're doing. So if you're looking at the trend impact analysis approach and you're looking at what's happened historically, you need to make sure that that historical data is tied to what you're seeing as emerging issues and what things are happening in the future, so that you can make sure that whatever is happening is part of your risk management practice. So part of that solution is integrating your forecasting and your risk prioritization approaches. So again, trying to remove as many silos as you can to better connect emerging issues to decision making. And I often bring upon this boiled frog phenomenon, which might not be the best thing to do if this is your lunch hour, but understanding that, a frog, if it leaps into hot water, it's going to jump right out. But if you bring it to a slow boil, the frog's just going to remain until it cooks and it's dead. So you need to be sure that you're sensitive to gradual change. this is something that happens to organizations more often than we probably even understand, which is sometimes change is really gradual. So at what point does that change begin to impact you in a negative way? And so that's why having some sort of issues management process, some kind of forecasting that you're doing, horizon scanning that you're doing to make sure that the change that's happening, you're not just becoming immune to it and all of a sudden it really hurts you. So kind of in summary, we're talking about resilience depends upon the flexibility of different management strategies and being prepared to deal with a variety of unexpected outcomes. Because we all know that change happens, and sometimes change isn't what you predict. That no matter what your forecasting is, sometimes things happen that you're not ready for. And so you need to be, whatever your strategies that you have in place, they need to be flexible enough and adaptive enough to be able to manage whatever comes your way. So let's do our last poll, and this is, does your organization use an issue management process?
We'll leave the poll open for a couple more seconds here.
Okay, so only 10% of you said that you didn't know, which is way lower than I thought it was going to be. About 30% of you said no, and with the remaining saying yes. What I'm going to ask you to do, because we do have a couple of minutes, is if you could use the questions pane to, for those of you that do, if you could share how that, in just a couple of words, like maybe who's responsible for the issue management process. Is it part of your job responsibility? Is it someone else's? If there's, because this is a webinar, we aren't able to allow people to speak, but I would like to be able for you to share that information, if you would. We have about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to summarize by saying that forecasting techniques can be used as a way to identify potential change, and that once issues are identified, they need to be evaluated to determine their impact, whether positive or negative, on the organization, and that managing change results in a more prepared organization in addition to one that is more competitive in the marketplace. And I think the more that as people who manage risk and business continuity and manage crises, whether you're doing it on the IT side of the house or on the audit side of the house, whatever it is, or supply chain, whatever your role is, that we can make sure that what we're doing is helping our organization to be more competitive in the marketplace. Because then we're driving value and we're not just seen as the parts of the organization that deal when we have a disaster, that we have a real role in the organization day to day. We have several different references here. If you haven't had a chance to purchase the standard on organizational resilience, you might find that is something that you're interested in. This paper that was written, it actually was written in 2008, and Paul C. Light works for New York University, and it's part of the Center for Catastrophe Preparedness and Response, and he has other things that are also really interesting. It's under a acronym called PERI, P-E-R-I. So you can look and see what other articles that he's written, other papers that he's written. But I really thought, even though this was 8 years old, I'm sorry, I can do my math, it's 10 years old, that I thought that this was something that still has value today. And then there's just a couple of references on how to do the different methods. And if you go to the UK government's program on horizon scanning, they have a ton of different links in there and their methodology. And they also have some papers on showing the outcomes of what they started and initiated in 2013 that you might find valuable. And I think just because it's government, don't say it doesn't have any value for you, because the methodology that they're using would work for any type of organization. And then the last, or actually the fifth reference here is how horizon scanning was used within the healthcare world, and how they did their hiring practices for the workforce. So I thought this was a really useful approach of using horizon scanning in a way that we might not be familiar with, and really in how they do their hiring practices in the healthcare world, which I thought was fascinating. And then the last one is it's a scholarly article. This link gives you a free link, but they also have it available for purchase through some of the different schools where it's part of their recommended reading. And it has such a long title that it actually didn't fit on the slide, like many PhD papers. But it's called Integrating Horizon Scanning and Strategic Risk Prioritization. If you're interested in learning more, this webinar is actually a part of the Crisis Management Communication Professional e-learning course that we offer under the title of CMC 5000. And right now this course is just e-learning, and you can challenge the certification exam as well as online. But we are planning on moving this to be a 3-day instructor-led course as well sometime in the next year, so watch for that. Our continuing webinar series, the webinar that we had scheduled for March, our speaker became ill and was unable to do that, so that has been rescheduled for December, and I'm sorry it isn't on the schedule here. It has to do with reputation management. The one that we're scheduled for May is on understanding critical environments, so looking at your data center and other critical environments. In June, I'm going to be talking about risk appetite. This is ironically here at RIMS. There was several presentations on risk appetite here, and they all said that this is one of the hardest things that not just top management has a challenge with, but also because top management has a challenge with it, it makes it hard for the rest of the teams to implement things in a way that meets top management's risk appetite, even if they're not really sure how they can document that. In July, we're going to talk about managing storage, so looking at an IT aspect. In August, we're going to look at incident response and putting together an incident response capability. September will also be more of an IT approach, looking at preserving, protecting, and recovering data. October will be more on information security. And in November, we're going to talk about what kind of workforce do you need to be more resilient. So let's go to our questions. So one organization uses a risk register, and they use that by the risk committees, and they review that globally. So this is part of how they do their forecasting. Another organization, their corporation's communication leads is using that. And that's really interesting because that would make sense that if you need to put together your communications for an incident that happens, that you would maybe have those some forecasting done to think about what kinds of things that you might want to be doing, as well as their marketing team, I think. The risk team is tracking this with another organization. And then this person said that all issues go through second line of defense functions, typically operational risk, for tracking, reporting, remediation, and remediation testing, if applicable. So I've never heard of what a second line defense function is, so that's interesting. I don't know if that's on the IT space or more of an agency language. So Brandy, if you want to add any more, I'll see if we can get to it before we close today. The next person says that they have an incident management team, and we have monthly meetings to go over all incident, information security, risk management, environmental health and safety, and so forth. So that's really interesting because that shows that you're doing collaboration among potential silos and making sure that you guys are communicating the risks and issues that you might have within those different areas and become aware of those. That's really great. This next gentleman said that they have a formal department for production issues and a formal process for other issue resolutions that might be longer term. So that's interesting to see how, in fact, a lot of the examples that I saw in issues management had to do with manufacturing, production, even especially project management. So if you go to PMI, there's quite a bit of literature under the Project Management Institute on handling project issues. So things that are stopping a project from moving forward and how to manage those. So that's another area where I find the Project Management Institute is a really great resource for, because what you're doing, almost everything that we're doing is project management in some aspect, and using project management strategically as well. So I think that's a great thing to do. And then the next person said that they look at issues or gaps and they address that but with their leadership team, and then it rolls up to the risk committee as required. The next person uses it as a consultant and a business executive coach. She uses incident or issue management when she starts an engagement to develop the starting action plan for her work with clients. And that makes a lot of sense, because as an outsider coming as a consultant, you know, you might not be as aware of things. So having a process for managing issues that might come forward, even managing change, you know, what you're hired to do and what you end up being asked to do might be different things as you get started with the project. So issues are often operational that need to be mitigated or resolved in order to move forward. We've had a request to email the links to the papers. So I'm hoping that by Friday, just like all of our other webinars, the webinar series, or this webinar will be posted on our webinar page so that you can view it. And you should be able to download it so that you can get to those links. But when we send, everybody who attended the webinar today will have the opportunity, we'll be receiving a certificate of attendance. So you get your 1 hour of CEUs if you need points to maintain any of your certifications. And so I'm going to ask the person that emails out those to email out the links as well, so that you'll each have those. Thank you very much for attending today. I appreciate you being here and for also sharing how you've implemented some of these things. So again, our next webinar is on May 23rd, and we hope that you can attend, or if you can't attend, to have one of your teams, you know, on the critical environment side attend. So thank you, and have a good rest of the day.